On the morning of August 25, 2014, in a rural stretch of Kimball County, Missouri, an old man named John Bailey, known as Jack, the familiar operator of a small ferry service on the Bourbers River, began his day as usual. As his old John boat glided quietly over the water, still shrouded in the early morning mist, a foul, overpowering stench, the unmistakable smell of a decaying animal carcass, suddenly hit his nostrils. Looking around, he spotted a large, blue and white-striped burlap sack, swollen and caught in a dense thicket of reeds along the bank. Figuring some thoughtless local had dumped a dead pig into the river, and with the good intention of pulling it out to be buried for the sake of the waterway, Jack called over Billy Carter, a strong young man from the area, to help. The sack was incredibly heavy, saturated with water. As the two men struggled to haul it onto the grassy bank beneath an ancient sycamore tree, they realized the shape inside was strange, not at all like an animal. A mix of curiosity and a dark premonition washed over them. Billy carefully untied the frayed nylon rope cinching the sack's opening. The moment the mouth of the sack fell open, both men froze. Billy let out a blood-curdling scream and fell backward, his face pale as a sheet. Jack Bailey, despite his long years, stood as if struck by lightning, his whole body trembling. Inside the sack, amidst the stagnant water and mud, was a mass of matted, long black hair and part of a human face, bloated and disfigured. There was no doubt. It was the body of a woman. The horrifying news was quickly relayed to the Kimball County Sheriff's Department. Recognizing the extreme severity of the case, officers from the Criminal Investigation Unit and crime scene technicians from the Missouri State Highway Patrol were on the scene within less than an hour, under the direct command of Captain Marcus Thorne, head of the unit. The area was immediately cordoned off with a security perimeter stretching several hundred yards. Captain Thorne, a seasoned investigator with a weather-beaten face and sharp eyes, ordered his units to begin the examination. The 5-person crime scene team, dressed in full-body protective gear, started their work in silent, professional unison. No detail, however small, was to be overlooked. One forensic technician meticulously photographed the entire scene from various angles, from the top of the bank down to the water's edge. Another used a measuring tape to pinpoint the exact location of the sack relative to fixed objects like the sycamore tree and the water line. The burlap sack, the first crucial piece of evidence, was examined closely. It was a 100-pound capacity blue and white feed sack, still relatively new. The rope used to tie it was a green nylon type commonly used in agriculture. A technician carefully cut a sample piece of the rope and sealed it in a separate evidence bag. The most difficult task was the on-site examination of the body. The technicians gently removed the corpse from the sack and laid it on a clean plastic top. The victim was a female, preliminarily estimated to be between 50 and 60 years old, approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition from being submerged for days. The skin was bloated and peeling in many places, emitting a putrid odor that forced non-essential personnel to keep their distance. The victim was wearing a faded, light-flowered linen pajama set, caked in mud. Lieutenant Leo Miles, the lead forensics officer, approached Captain Thorne and reported that a preliminary examination suggested the body had been in the water for about 4 to 6 days. He noted multiple subcutaneous hematomas on the victim's face and head, and that the jawbone showed signs of being fractured by a blow from a blunt object or an extremely powerful punch. He confirmed they had found no sharp force injuries, and that it was highly likely the victim was deceased before being put in the river. Captain Thorne nodded, his gaze fixed intently on the still body, stating firmly that it was a homicide, with the body dumped to cover their tracks. He believed the killer had planned this carefully, using the river to hinder identification and destroy evidence. He turned to his detectives and asked if they had gotten statements from Bailey and Carter and whether the witnesses had provided anything useful. A detective replied that they had not. The men were the first to find it but had no additional information, and they confirmed they had never seen that sack there before. The on-site investigation lasted over 3 hours. Every piece of evidence from the sack and rope to soil and water samples was collected and carefully sealed. The victim's body was then transported in a specialized vehicle to the state medical examiner's office for a detailed autopsy to determine the precise cause of death and, more importantly, to attempt to establish her identity. At a field command post set up at the Kimball County Sheriff's Substation, Captain Thorne convened an urgent meeting with the key members of the newly formed task force. Captain Thorne directed that their number one priority was to identify the victim. Without an identity, they had no starting point. He wanted the General Investigation Team to immediately review all missing person reports filed in Missouri and neighboring states within the last 10 days, paying close attention to middle-aged female victims with similar physical characteristics. He turned to Lieutenant Miles and said that on the forensic side, he needed his team to focus all efforts on getting fingerprints from the victim. He knew it was a long shot given the condition of the body, but it was their best hope. At the same time, he ordered them to run DNA analysis and examine the fibers and mud they had collected to see if they could provide any clue as to the origin. Another team of detectives was assigned to travel up the Bourbers River from the crime scene, canvassing residents to see if anyone had noticed anything unusual in the past few days. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but in a homicide investigation, no possibility could be ignored. The investigation began with intense urgency but immediately hit a wall of difficulties. Dozens of missing person cases were reviewed, but none matched the victim's description. The riverbank canvass yielded no results. The river remained silent, guarding its secret. All hopes now rested on the state medical examiner's office. In the autopsy lab, the state's best forensic pathologists faced a daunting challenge. The skin on the victim's 10 fingertips was severely damaged by the water, wrinkled and blistered, almost formless. Standard fingerprinting methods were impossible. They had to resort to a complex technique requiring absolute patience and precision. After treating the skin with specialized chemicals to harden and partially restore the epidermis, the pathologists used a scalpel to carefully peel the entire layer of skin from all 10 fingertips away from the underlying tissue. The work was like microsurgery. One small slip could completely destroy the fragile remaining traces. Then, the most experienced examiner carefully wore the victim's fingertip skin over their own gloved finger, like a biological thimble, and slowly, meticulously rolled the prints onto a special card. This process was repeated dozens of times to capture the clearest possible images. But the results were still imperfect, with many ridges broken or faded. The most advanced digital fingerprint scanner was brought in. The faint prints were digitized. Then, the experts began another painstaking task, using graphic software to reconnect each broken ridge, reconstructing the overall fingerprint structure based on the remaining characteristic points. This work continued non-stop for 3 days and 3 nights. Finally, on the afternoon of August 28th, a complete set of fingerprints was successfully reconstructed on the computer. It was immediately sent to the FBI to be run against the National AFIS database. The entire task force held its breath. Just 15 minutes later, an urgent notification came back. The chime of a new message sounded on Captain Thorne's phone. He opened it and read. On the screen was the information they had been waiting for all this time. Identity confirmed. Patricia Nelson. Date of birth, May 12, 1964. Last known address, Rural Route 2, Annville, Lafayette County, Missouri. The first and most critical knot of the case had been untangled. The victim was from Lafayette County, a county upstream from where the body was found. This fit perfectly with the river's current. Captain Thorne immediately assembled an elite team and commanded everyone to get in the cars, his voice like steel. They were going to Lafayette County, to the victim's home. Night had just fallen over the rural community of Annville when 2 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of a modest, well-kept single-story house. A warm yellow light from the window indicated someone was still awake inside. Captain Marcus Thorne adjusted his jacket, his face set in deep concentration. Beside him were the task force's sharpest detectives and investigators. Their mission tonight was to approach the victim's family and, more importantly, to observe the reactions of those closest to her people who could be grieving loved ones, or could be killers. Captain Thorne knocked lightly on the metal screen door. A few seconds later, a stout, older man in house clothes opened it. It was Thomas Lang, known as Tom, the victim's husband, the first person of interest in the case file. Lang greeted the officers and asked if he could help them, his voice tinged with surprise but maintaining a calm demeanor. Captain Thorne identified himself and his officers from the Missouri State Highway Patrol, holding up his badge. He said they would like to come in and speak with the family about a matter concerning Patricia Nelson and asked if Mrs. Nelson was home. A flicker of unease crossed Lang's face, but he quickly concealed it and invited them in. He told the officers that his wife was out of town, having gone down to Florida to visit their youngest son about a week ago. The entire team stepped into the living room. Inside, a pretty young woman holding a little girl of about 4 years old quickly stood up. This was Heather Nash, the victim's daughter-in-law. Upon seeing the police uniforms, the color drained from Heather's face. Her eyes darted with panic, and the hand stroking her child's back instinctively tightened its grip. This reaction did not escape the notice of Captain Thorne and his detectives. Captain Thorne confirmed her identity as Heather Nash, Patricia's daughter-in-law. Heather replied with a trembling voice that yes, that was her. The captain then asked when was the last time she had seen her mother-in-law. Heather glanced quickly at Tom Lang, as if seeking help, before stammering that her mother-in-law had left on the 21st. She said the night of the 20th was the last time she saw her, and she had mentioned going to visit her brother-in-law and then taking a little vacation. Their stories matched perfectly, but the consistency felt rehearsed. Captain Thorne continued to press their psychological weak points, asking if the family had been in contact with Mrs. Nelson since she left. This time, Tom Lang answered, his voice still trying to sound composed. He explained that they had tried calling a few times but could not get through. He supposed she had probably gotten a new number for the trip or just did not want to be disturbed, adding that she had always been like that and disliked being bothered when she was away. A perfect script, a wife and mother on vacation, out of touch. But this script had a fatal flaw. Captain Thorne decided it was time to drop the bombshell. He addressed Mr. Lang and Heather, his voice lowering as he looked directly at each of them. He told them that everything they had just said was a lie. He regretfully informed them that they had found the body of Patricia Nelson on the morning of August 25th in Kimball County. He stated that the medical examiner's office had confirmed her identity and that she had been murdered. The raw truth detonated like a bomb in the middle of the living room. Heather screamed, dropping the child she was holding onto the sofa. She stumbled backward, her face as white as paper, her body shaking uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Tom Lang, though stunned, tried to keep his act together. He growled that it was impossible, his eyes wide. He demanded to know what they were talking about, questioning if his wife had really been killed and who had killed her. He tried to feign outrage and grief, but in the eyes of a man who had seen it all, Captain Thorne saw no sorrow, only the panic and fear of someone who had been exposed. Captain Thorne said sternly that was exactly what they were there to find out. He declared that because their statements were full of contradictions, the house was now being considered a potential crime scene. He needed everyone to stay exactly where they were and not move or touch anything, as they were going to conduct a search. The captain's order officially transformed the father and daughter-in-law from family members into primary suspects. Immediately, the officers on the team sprang into action. 2 detectives were posted at the front and back doors. Another team quickly spread out into the neighborhood to canvass, speaking with the nearest neighbors. They needed to know when anyone last saw Patricia Nelson and if they heard or saw anything unusual on the night she supposedly left for Florida. Meanwhile, Captain Thorne and Lieutenant Miles, the forensics lead, began a preliminary walkthrough of the house. The living room where they stood was suspiciously clean. The linoleum floor shone, not a speck of dust in sight, and the furniture was carefully wiped down. However, when Lieutenant Miles shined a high-intensity UV light on the floor, he discovered several areas that fluoresced differently. It was a sign that the floor had been scrubbed with a powerful chemical cleaner. Lieutenant Miles whispered to the captain that it looked like the scene was cleaned up, and cleaned up well. Captain Thorne nodded and walked over to where Tom and Heather were sitting. Both were staring at the floor, not daring to look at anyone. He asked if they had done any major repairs or cleaning in the house in the last 10 days or so. Heather answered in a tiny voice that they had not. The captain then asked why the floor smelled so strongly of bleach. The unexpected question made them both jump. Tom Lang quickly tried to cover, explaining it was because his granddaughter had spilled a bottle of ink on the floor, and Heather had to use bleach to get the stain out. Another clumsy lie. Captain Thorne did not press further. He knew that any answers they gave now were meaningless. The truth would be found in the silent traces left behind. He ordered the forensics team to seal the entire house. A full CSI team with complete equipment would arrive in the morning to conduct the most thorough and detailed examination possible. At the same time, other investigative teams began reporting their initial findings. One team had managed to contact Patricia Nelson's youngest son, who was attending university in St. Louis. The young man was utterly shocked to hear of his mother's murder and confirmed a crucial fact. His mother had absolutely no plans to visit him, and he had not been able to reach her for over a week. The lie about the Florida vacation, told by his father and sister-in-law, was completely exposed. The neighborhood canvas team also gathered a significant piece of information. A next-door neighbor reported that around 11 p.m. on the night of August 20th, she heard a loud scream from the Lang's house, followed by a heavy thud, like something large falling or breaking. But then everything went quiet, so she just assumed it was the couple having one of their usual arguments and did not think any more of it. The scream, the thud, the lies, the scrubbed crime scene, all the details were beginning to link together, painting a horrifying picture of a crime that had taken place right inside this seemingly peaceful home. As the clock struck midnight, Captain Thorne decided it was time to bring the two suspects in for interrogation. He announced that Thomas Lang and Heather Nash, due to numerous suspicious statements directly related to the death of Patricia Nelson, were being requested to go with them to the State Patrol headquarters for questioning. Heather burst into tears. Tom Lang, despite his efforts to remain calm, could not hide the trembling in his hands. The two were escorted out to the cars by officers. The 4-year-old girl, who had just woken up amidst the chaos, saw her mother being led away by strangers and began to wail. Her cries tore through the quiet country night. As the car carrying the two suspects drove away from Anvil, many residents were still awake. They stood in small groups, watching the police cars with looks of confusion, fear, and outrage. They could not understand what was happening to the family they had always considered a model for the whole community. The velvet curtain of a perfect play had been torn down, revealing a stage covered in blood and sin. The investigation had only just begun, but for the task force, the killers had all but revealed themselves. The only remaining question was how to make them confess. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's Criminal Investigation Unit headquarters was quiet at night, but inside, the investigative machinery was running with high-level urgency and focus. Thomas Lang and Heather Nash were placed in separate interrogation rooms immediately upon arrival. The criminal procedure was carried out swiftly. Initial statements, mugshots, fingerprints. For the father and daughter-in-law, each step felt like another move closer to a prison cell, stripping away their status as ordinary citizens bit by bit. Tom Lang, with his weathered composure, appeared cooperative during the initial procedures but remained absolutely silent about the case itself. He sat quietly in the interrogation room, his empty gaze fixed on the white wall. Meanwhile, in another room, Heather Nash had completely broken down. She just sobbed, her cries filled with fear and despair, unable to form words. Captain Thorne decided against an immediate interrogation. He knew that with suspects who have had time to prepare psychologically, an immediate confrontation would be ineffective. Instead, he wanted to wait to let the silence, the isolation, and the pressure of the four walls wear down their spirits. More importantly, he needed to wait for the most conclusive physical evidence from the teams still working tirelessly. In the early morning of August 29th, while the two suspects endured the longest night of their lives, a team from the forensic unit arrived at the victim's house in Anvil to begin a comprehensive examination. The house had been sealed since the previous night. Everything was untouched. The work began in the living room, which had been identified as the primary crime scene. Although the floor had been thoroughly scrubbed, the technicians believed that a crime could never be completely erased. They turned off all the lights, drew the curtains, and plunged the room into darkness. Then, a technician began to spray a special chemical, luminol, across the entire floor surface. And then, a ghastly sight emerged. Under the chemical's effect, invisible bloodstains began to luminesce, appearing in the darkness as an eerie blue glow. A large, mottled pool was visible in the middle of the living room, with smaller splatters reaching as far as the baseboards. The glowing bloodstains traced the trajectory of a brutal attack and the spot where Patricia Nelson had collapsed. The technicians carefully photographed the entire scene and collected samples for DNA analysis. Any claims by Tom Lang about his wife accidentally cutting her hand were now utterly refuted. Next, the entire house was meticulously searched. Tiny fragments of broken glass found under a display cabinet were collected and placed in an evidence bag, waiting to be reassembled to determine the shape of the original object, possibly a drinking glass. In the master bedroom, everything seemed normal. But when they examined an old utility trailer parked in a corner of the storage shed, the technicians discovered crucial clues. To the naked eye, the trailer looked clean. But using a specialized light source and a magnifying glass, they found several blue and white fibers whose structure and color perfectly matched the burlap sack used to contain the victim's body. Furthermore, in a crevice on the wooden floor of the trailer bed, they found a tiny, dried speck of blood. All these traces, though minuscule, were ironclad evidence directly linking the two suspects to the disposal of the body. Simultaneously, at headquarters, the digital data analysis team also had results. A video clip extracted from a neighbor's security camera had been processed by experts, enhancing its resolution and brightness. Although faces were still unrecognizable, the images of the two subjects were much clearer. The build of the older man hunched over, pulling the trailer, and the younger woman sitting in the back perfectly matched Tom Lang and Heather Nash. Crucially, the experts were able to identify a key feature on the utility trailer. One of the wheels was slightly bent to detail that perfectly matched the trailer seized at the scene. And then, at noon that same day, the final, detailed forensic autopsy report was delivered to Captain Thorne. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the sharpest weapon to break the suspect's stubborn silence. The 7-page report detailed every injury on the victim's body. It reconfirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation due to drowning. But the most critical detail was in the microscopic analysis section. The medical examiners had found water, algae, and microorganisms specific to the Bourbers River in the victim's alveoli. This was irrefutable scientific proof of a horrifying truth. Patricia Nelson was still breathing when she was thrown into the water. All the evidence was now assembled. Captain Thorne knew the time had come to confront the two killers directly. He decided he would personally interrogate Thomas Lang, the stubborn one and likely the mastermind of the crime. Heather Nash, the weaker link, would be handled by Detective Sarah Reed, an investigator with experience and subtlety in interrogating female suspects. The formal interrogation began at 2 p.m. In Interrogation Room 1, Captain Thorne sat opposite Tom Lang. There were no more roundabout questions. He went straight to the point. He told Mr. Lang that after a full day of investigation, they had enough evidence to prove that he and his daughter-in-law had murdered Patricia Nelson. He advised Lang to confess honestly to receive any chance of leniency. Tom Lang smirked, a forced, hollow smile. He asked what evidence they had and told the captain not to try to scare him. He claimed he did not do anything, so he had nothing to be afraid of. Captain Thorne calmly said all right. He placed a series of clear, color photos on the table. He explained that one was a picture of the living room after being treated with chemicals and that the blue glowing patches were his wife's blood, which was all over the floor. He then asked if Lang still wanted to say she had just cut her hand. Tom Lang looked at the photos, the color draining from his face. Captain Thorne continued, placing another sealed evidence bag on the table containing blue and white fibers. He stated these were fibers from the sack that held his wife's body, found in the utility trailer in his shed, and asked how Lang could explain that coincidence. The old veteran began to breathe heavily. Captain Thorne then pushed the forensic report towards Lang, flipping to the final page and pointing to the conclusion. He said the forensic analysis showed that his wife, Patricia Nelson, was still alive when he and his daughter-in-law threw her into the river. He accused them of not just killing his wife, but letting her die a slow, agonizing death in the cold water. He asked if Lang was even human. This final psychological blow struck the last weak point of the seemingly iron-willed man. The thought that he had drowned a person who was still alive, the wife he had spent his life with, sent him into a true panic. He could no longer maintain his defiant facade. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumped, but he remained silent. Meanwhile, in Interrogation Room 2, Detective Reed employed a completely different tactic. She did not present a single piece of evidence. She just sat there, looking at Heather Nash with an expression full of empathy. Detective Reed began by telling Heather that they had arranged for her daughter to be temporarily cared for by her maternal grandparents that morning, and that the girl kept crying for her mommy, being too young to understand what was happening. Hearing her daughter mentioned, Heather began to cry again. Detective Reed continued gently, saying she was a mother too and understood how sacred a mother's love for her child is. She asked Heather if she loved her daughter. Heather sobbed that yes, she did, more than her own life. The detective then asked why she would push her future into a dead end like this. She asked if Heather realized that if she continued to stay silent, stubbornly covering up the crime, she would face a very severe sentence. Her little girl would grow up without a mother by her side and would have to bear the shame of her mother being a heartless murderer. She asked if that was what Heather wanted. The detective's words were like knives cutting into Heather's heart. She looked up at Detective Reed with tear-filled, pleading eyes and asked what she should do now. Detective Reed said firmly for her to tell the truth. She explained that only the truth could save her soul and give her a chance, however small, to one day return to her daughter. She urged Heather to tell them who the real mastermind was and who had brutally attacked her mother-in-law. She told Heather that cooperating with them was the only way for her, and for her daughter. The final defensive wall in Heather Nash's mind completely crumbled. She had no reason to continue the cover-up. Between her guilty father-in-law on one side and the future of her precious daughter on the other, she had made her choice. Detective Reed's words were not an accusation but a sincere piece of advice that completely shattered the already fragile defensive wall around Heather Nash. The young woman collapsed onto the table, her shoulders shaking violently. The silence stretched for several minutes, filled only by the sound of her muffled sobs growing louder. Finally, between choked gasps, she looked up, her tear-drenched eyes meeting the detectives. She had made her choice. She whispered, her voice hoarse, that she would confess everything. She said it was all because of her father-in-law, and because of her. The audio recorder was turned on. Another detective quickly opened a notebook to take down the official statement. And then, the horrifying memories of that fateful night, August 20th, began to pour out through Heather Nash's tears of remorse. Her confession did not start with the blow, but with the months of loneliness in her own home. She spoke of her husband working far from home, of the emptiness, and the normal desires of a young woman in her prime. She spoke of her father-in-law's attention, at first awkward, then gradually becoming bolder. She sobbed that she was so scared at first and had tried to avoid him, but then she could not control herself. She had betrayed her husband. She was guilty. The incestuous relationship, according to Heather, had been going on for over 6 months. They were secretive, meeting when Patricia was out or during hot summer afternoons. The guilt was like a drug, bringing both fear and a sinful thrill she could not break away from. And then she spoke of that horrific night. Her account essentially matched what the task force had already pieced together. After putting her daughter to bed, she went to clean the kitchen. Tom Lang was watching TV in the living room. As she walked past, he pulled her to him, and they gave in to their desires right there in the living room. Heather recounted, trembling, that just then, her mother-in-law woke up. She had come out for a drink of water and saw everything. The glass in her hand fell and shattered. She did not say anything, just stood there staring at them. Heather said she would never forget the look in her eyes, which was full of pain and disgust. And then she screamed. Heather squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to block out the memory. She said the scream panicked her father-in-law. He lunged at her without a word and punched her right in the face, a really hard punch. Her mother-in-law fell, her head hit the floor, and blood started coming from her mouth. Detective Reed asked calmly if she was dead at that point. Heather shook her head frantically, saying that they thought she was dead. She said her father-in-law had checked her breathing, listened for a heartbeat, and said she was gone. Heather was so scared, all she could do was cry. It was him who said they had to get rid of the body. He said if they were caught, they would both go to prison. She was terrified of going to prison because her daughter was so young, so she agreed. She recounted the entire process of disposing of the body in trembling detail. She described how she and Tom struggled to get Patricia's body into the burlap feed sack. She remembered the cold, limp feeling of her mother-in-law's body as she touched it. She described helping Tom tie the sack shut with the green nylon rope. She continued that her father-in-law then got the utility trailer. The two of them lifted the sack onto it. It was so heavy. They had to pull the trailer on the back roads behind the village to avoid being seen. There was no moon that night. It was pitch black. The only sounds were the squeaking of the trailer wheels and the frogs croaking in the fields. After about a mile, they reached the bank of the Bourbers River. They pushed the sack into the water together. It sank immediately. Then they rushed back home. When asked what they did when they got home, she explained that her father-in-law told her to get rags and bleach. He cleaned the pool of blood in the living room himself. He even picked up all the broken pieces of the glass, put them in a bag, and threw it away the next day. He told her that if anyone asked, she had to say her mother-in-law had gone to Florida to visit her brother-in-law. He said as long as they both said the same thing, no one would ever suspect a thing. The confession, lasting nearly 2 hours, laid bare the entire truth of the case. Every word Heather spoke was recorded and transcribed. After she finished, exhausted, she still managed to read over the entire statement. Then, with a trembling hand, She signed her name to it. That thin piece of paper was, on one hand, evidence of a crime, but on the other, the only release for the tormented conscience of a guilty woman. As soon as he had Heather Nash's signed confession, Captain Thorne knew the decisive moment had arrived. Carrying a copy of the statement, he and Detective Reed walked into Thomas Lang's interrogation room. The old veteran was still sitting there with a defiant, stubborn look on his face. He believed that as long as he kept quiet, the police would not have enough evidence to convict him. He had no idea that his only ally had completely folded. The interrogation room door opened. Captain Thorne entered, followed by Detective Reed. He said nothing, simply walked to the table and slammed the file down in front of Tom Lang. On the top page was Heather Nash's signed confession, the ink still fresh. Captain Thorne asked, his voice as cold as ice, if he cared to read it. He stated that his daughter-in-law, his lover, his accomplice, Heather Nash, had confessed to everything. She had told them all about their affair, how he had murdered his wife, and how the two of them had thrown her body into the Berbers River. Tom Lang looked down at the paper. He skimmed the lines. He saw his name, his wife's name, his daughter-in-law's name. He read about the punch, the sack, the utility trailer. Every word on that paper was like a knife stabbing at his defiance. And then, when he saw Heather Nash's shaky signature at the bottom, the steel wall of defense he had tried so hard to build shattered into 1,000 pieces. His defiant face suddenly changed. His eyes widened in disbelief, which quickly turned to the rage and bitterness of a man betrayed. His breathing became ragged, his hands clenched into fists, veins popping on their backs. He could not believe that the person he trusted most, the woman for whom he had disregarded all morality to possess, the one who shared his darkest secret, was the first one to turn on him. The silence in the room was now heavier than 1,000 questions. It was the silence of a cornered beast realizing it was utterly alone. The silence in the interrogation room was suffocating. The thin sheet of paper with Heather Nash's trembling words lay on the cold steel table, but its weight was like 1,000 pounds, crushing the last vestiges of the old veteran's iron will. He stared at his daughter-in-law's signature, then slowly raised his head to meet Captain Thorne's gaze. The defiance was gone, replaced by a look of exhaustion, resignation, and undisguised contempt. He was not enraged because his crime was exposed, but because he had been pushed off a cliff by the very accomplice he trusted. He hissed through clenched teeth, his voice hoarse and full of scorn, calling her a stupid woman. He reasoned that if she had confessed everything, there was no point in hiding it. It was not a confession born of remorse. It was the admission of a loser in a game he had lost. Captain Thorne knew the final wall had fallen. He signaled for the investigator to start the recorder and prepare to take the official statement. Captain Thorne said, his voice still stern, for him to confess everything honestly, and he might receive leniency from the court. He instructed him to tell them everything that happened on the night of August 20th. Tom Lang let out a harsh breath and began to speak. His confession was starkly different from Heather's sobbing, broken account. His was cold, calculated, and sharp. He did not cry or show any fear. He recounted his crime as if he were debriefing a failed mission. He admitted to the illicit relationship with his daughter-in-law, but in his telling, he was not the initiator. He blamed loneliness, circumstance, and the flirtatious invitations of his beautiful young daughter-in-law. He shamelessly asked what man could resist temptation, especially with a flame that close to the tinder day after day, as if it were an inevitable law of nature rather than his own depraved choice. He recounted the fateful night, which he called the night of damnation. He admitted he could not control himself when he saw Heather in her thin sleepwear. But when he spoke of being caught by his wife, his tone became filled with malice. He said she screamed like a stuck pig, believing family matters should be handled behind closed doors, but she wanted the whole town to know. He felt that if she wanted to drag him through the mud, then he had nothing left to lose. He admitted to hitting his wife. He described the punch with cold detachment, without a hint of hesitation. But he insisted that he only wanted to silence her, that he never intended to kill her. He claimed he just wanted to knock her out and had no idea the punch would be so strong. When he checked for breath and could not find a pulse, he believed she was really dead. He insisted it was an accident. He tried to steer his crime from premeditated murder to manslaughter, a cunning calculation even in the midst of confessing. When asked about the plan to dispose of the body, he readily admitted to being the mastermind. He sneered that Heather was so scared she practically wet herself and could not possibly plan anything. He was the one who decided to throw the body in the river. He reasoned the Berbers has a strong current, and in a few days, it would wash up who knows where, and no one would ever find it. His confession painted a chillingly detailed picture of the cover-up. He described how after dumping Patricia's body, he and Heather returned home. He himself used rags, soap, and even some bleach to personally scrub the bloodstain in the living room. He carefully collected every shard of the broken glass, put them in a plastic bag, and the next morning drove nearly 2 miles to dump it in a public trash container. He even hosed down the utility trailer. Every action was performed with calculated calmness, completely unlike the actions of someone who had committed a crime in a state of panic. Though Tom Lang's and Heather Nash's confessions differed in tone and their attempts to blame each other, when cross-referenced, they matched perfectly in terms of timeline, location, and key actions. Together, they formed a perfect indictment for their own crime. The task force now had everything they needed. A few days later, after fully consolidating the case file and statements, the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Investigative Division officially filed charges. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Thomas Lang for first-degree murder and Heather Nash for first-degree murder as an accomplice. At the same time, another important decision was made: to conduct a crime scene reenactment to verify the confessions and further clarify each suspect's role. The reenactment took place on a morning in early September, specifically September 4th, 2014. News of the incestuous affair that led to a mother-in-law's murder and the dumping of her body had spread like wildfire through Lafayette County, causing a profound shock. From early morning, hundreds of curious townspeople from Annville and surrounding areas had gathered, lining the road leading to the Lang's house. Police had to work hard to maintain order. In the crowd, the atmosphere was no longer one of simple curiosity but of palpable outrage and disgust. Whispers and murmurs were constant. They could not believe that Tom Lang, the veteran they had always respected, could commit such a conscienceless act. They could not believe that Heather Nash, the pretty, gentle daughter-in-law they had often praised, could conspire with her father-in-law to kill her own mother-in-law. The image of a model family had been completely shattered, leaving only a raw and ugly truth. Around 8 a.m., 2 police transport vans arrived. Thomas Lang and Heather Nash, now in striped prison jumpsuits, were escorted from the vehicles. Both kept their heads bowed to avoid the hateful stares and curses from the crowd. Lang, though trying to appear calm, looked gaunt and much older. Heather was a complete wreck. She could barely walk and had to be supported by 2 female officers. The reenactment began. Under the close supervision of the prosecutor's office, investigators had the 2 defendants reenact their entire criminal sequence from that fateful night. A mannequin with the approximate height and weight of Patricia Nelson was used to recreate the scene. With a numb expression, Tom Lang reenacted the scene of him and Heather being discovered. He mechanically threw a punch at the mannequin. Every action, from checking for a pulse to discussing the disposal plan, was reenacted with sharp precision. When it was Heather Nash's turn to help Lang lift the mannequin into the burlap sack, she could not take it anymore. She collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking. She wailed in despair, apologizing to her mother-in-law. The reenactment had to be paused for several minutes for officers to calm her down. The final part of the reenactment was recreating the process of taking the body to the river. The father and daughter-in-law once again had to place the sack containing the mannequin onto the old utility trailer and pull it down the familiar country road. Following them were the investigators, and behind them, the eyes of hundreds of townspeople. The short road from the house to the Berbers River had now become a path of shame. Standing on the riverbank, where the water still flowed lazily by, the 2 defendants performed the final act, pushing the sack into the water. The sack sank, sending out ripples that quickly disappeared, just as they had on that horrific night. But this time, their crime was not hidden by darkness but was exposed to the light of justice and the judgment of their community. The crime scene reenactment provided crucial corroborating evidence, reinforcing the consistency between the defendants' confessions and the physical evidence. The case was now almost completely solved. Combined with the final DNA results confirming the blood at the scene and on the trailer belonged to Patricia Nelson, and the fiber analysis matching the sack to the fibers found on the trailer, the task force had an ironclad case. The entire case file, evidence, and investigative report were completed by the State Highway Patrol. A few days later, They formally transferred the entire case to the Lafayette County Prosecutor's Office, recommending the prosecution of Thomas Lang and Heather Nash for murder, with aggravating circumstances of exceptional brutality and depravity. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, preparing to deliver a fitting sentence for a crime that had horrified an entire peaceful community. 3 months after the crime scene reenactment, on a bleak winter morning, December 18, 2014, the Lafayette County Circuit Court convened the trial of defendants Thomas Lang and Heather Nash. The case of incest, murder, and body disposal had shocked the public for months. Consequently, a large crowd of local citizens and dozens of media outlets attended the trial. From early in the morning, the courthouse square was packed. People came not just out of curiosity, but to witness justice being served for a crime that trampled on all foundations of social morality. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with silence and tension. Under the stark white fluorescent lights, everything felt cold, from the state seal hanging solemnly on the wall to the dark brown wooden benches. In the front row reserved for the victim's family sat 2 young men, their faces etched with an indescribable pain. They were Michael Lang, the eldest son, and his younger brother. Michael had to fly back immediately from his job overseas upon hearing the news. In an instant, he had lost everything. His hard-working mother, brutally murdered. The father he had always respected, now her killer. And the wife he deeply loved, an accomplice and his own father's lover. The pain and humiliation were so immense that the once strong and healthy man looked as if he had aged a decade. Around 8:30 a.m., the 2 defendants were escorted into the courtroom. Thomas Lang, after a few months in custody, looked thinner and more haggard, but his eyes still held a defiant, careless glint. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting his son's for only a second before quickly looking away. In contrast, Heather Nash looked like a soulless ghost. Her once beautiful face was now pale and gaunt, her eyes swollen and sunken from long, sleepless nights. She did not dare to look up, did not dare to look at anyone, especially not her husband sitting in the rows behind her. Every glance from Michael felt like 1,000 knives stabbing her guilty heart. The trial began. After reading the indictment, the Lafayette County prosecutor stood up to deliver the opening statement. His steady, stern voice recounted the defendant's entire crime, from the sinful, incestuous relationship to the brutal act of murder and disposal of the body. Every detail, every act was described clearly and starkly, causing the entire courtroom to fall into a breathless silence. Many in the audience could not suppress their gasps and angry whispers. The examination of the defendants followed. Standing at the defendant's stand, Thomas Lang answered the judge's questions with considerable clarity. He admitted to the acts as described in the indictment but still tried to justify his crimes. He claimed that hitting his wife was a result of being strongly provoked, of losing control, and that disposing of the body was an act of panic. He repeatedly blamed circumstances, alcohol, and the allure of his daughter-in-law, as if he were merely a victim of fate. His evasive attitude, showing not a shred of remorse, deeply angered the attendees, especially Patricia Nelson's relatives. When it was Heather Nash's turn, the atmosphere changed completely. She just stood there, her hands clutching the rail, tears welling in her eyes. Before each question from the judge, it took her a long moment to answer through choked sobs. She did not deny her guilt, nor did she make excuses. She earnestly confessed all her mistakes, from failing to uphold her marital vows to not daring to stop her father-in-law's heinous act. She said, her voice breaking, that she was guilty before her mother, her husband, and her daughter. She felt she deserved to die and begged the court to give her the harshest sentence to atone for the unforgivable wrongs she had committed. The most emotional and painful moment of the trial was when Michael Lang, as the legal representative for the victim, was called to give a statement. He stood up, trying to remain calm, but his voice trembled with emotion. He did not look at the judge or jury but turned to face the 2 people at the stand. One was his father, the other his wife. He began, his voice choked with emotion, addressing his dad and Heather. He explained that for over a year, he had worked hard in a foreign country, day and night, just waiting for the day he could come home and be with his family. He thought when he came back, they would have a nicer house, his mom would not have to struggle anymore, and his wife would have a more comfortable life. But he never imagined the day he returned would be the day he would have to stand there. His mother was gone. His home was shattered. And the people who caused all of this were the very people he loved and trusted the most. He looked directly into his father's eyes and asked why. He recounted how his mom had lived with him her whole life and sacrificed everything for the family, questioning how he could be so cruel to her. He accused his father of destroying everything with his own hands for a moment of base desire. Then he turned to his wife and asked where he had gone wrong. He said he had worked abroad to give her and their child a better life and asked why she had betrayed him like this. He questioned how she could stand by and watch his mother be beaten to death without a single word of protest, and even help dispose of the evidence of the crime. The courtroom was silent, filled only with the sound of Heather Nash's uncontrollable sobs and Michael's pained voice. He said his family was gone now. He wondered how their daughter would live when she grew up, knowing her grandfather killed her grandmother, and her own mother was in prison. He told them they had not just killed his mother, they had killed the future of an innocent child. At this point, Michael Lang could no longer hold back. He broke down, the tears of a grown man streaming down his face. His words were like thousands of needles piercing the conscience of everyone present in the courtroom. After the closing arguments, the jury went to deliberate. The waiting period was long and incredibly tense. Finally, the jury foreman returned, and the judge began to read the verdict. In a firm voice, the judge declared that the defendant's actions were exceptionally heinous, not only taking a human life but also trampling upon the moral values and fundamental foundations of family and society. The incestuous relationship between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law was unacceptable. The act of murder and the brutal disposal of the body demonstrated the defendant's animalistic nature and complete loss of humanity. This crime, he stated, must be punished with the strictest sentence to serve as a deterrent to others and to uphold the sanctity of the law. After analyzing the role, nature, and degree of each defendant's guilt, the court delivered its final judgment. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the court found the defendant, Thomas Lang, who acted as the mastermind and directly carried out the act of murder, demonstrating extreme cruelty and a complete lack of humanity, with no possibility of rehabilitation. The court sentenced the defendant to death. Upon hearing the word death, Thomas Lang froze. His legs gave out, and he crumpled slightly. The defiant look on his face finally vanished, replaced by sheer panic and terror at the prospect of his own mortality. The judge continued. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the court found the defendant, Heather Nash, who acted as an accomplice, failing to intervene and assisting in concealing the crime. However, considering the defendant's sincere confession, remorse, and cooperation with the investigation, the court sentenced the defendant to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Heather Nash collapsed to the floor, weeping silently. Her life would now be spent behind the cold stone walls of a prison. The sentences were delivered amidst the sobs of the victim's family and the approval of the public in attendance. Justice had finally been served. The case was closed, but the pain and tragedy it left behind would endure. The well-kept house in Anvil now stands empty, its doors locked, a cold and haunting monument. After the trial, Michael Lang had to leave his young daughter in the care of her maternal grandparents and return to his life abroad, this time to escape a reality that was too painful to bear. The case by the Bourbers River will long be remembered by the people of this region, not for its thrilling, gruesome details, but as a costly warning about the destructive power of lust and betrayal. It shows how a wrongful relationship, an affair that one might think can be hidden, can give birth to the most devastating tragedies, turning ordinary people into monsters and a peaceful home into a tomb for family, morality, and the future.